my guest tonight, Jeff Sanders. Thank you so much, Jeff, for joining me today.
Oh, it's great to connect with you again, Clyde.
Absolutely. So you and I, we met at the conference that was being held in Victoria, the We Unify conference. You were there reporting on it, and you interviewed me. I thought it was a fantastic interview, and I'm glad we're able to connect with this, because I want to talk about journalism and the state of journalism in this country. It in my opinion, I think we've taken a step in the wrong direction. What do you think?
By we, are you talking about the media or everybody that's consumers?
I mean collectively we don't even view journalism as what it used to be. The guy in the trench coat that's just looking for the truth, or holding truth to power, this kind of thing. I think
Right.
on all ends of this, the consumers of media, they're unfamiliar with what journalism is even more anymore. And the media outlets, they're not even they don't even feel like they're concerned with keeping these ethics like they used to in previous generations.
Yeah, well, I mean, I studied it 35 years ago when it was a more noble profession. And in the class that I was in, I mean, it was a different era back then, certainly. I mean, we didn't have credit cards and bank overdrafts and everything. So you kind of, everybody had to live by what they earned, I guess. But everybody that was in my class, we were all from pretty modest backgrounds. We didn't have any silver spoons in the group. Some of those people that I did go to school with have stayed in journalism ever since, and we're still in touch. We get together once in a while, but they're the best example of how journalism has absolutely changed from the way we were trained to do it. I had a 25-year gap from when I stopped writing back in my early 20s to when I kind of resumed it again a few years ago. So I was thinking maybe I hadn't been tainted by, the changing landscape. But, quality of content has no place or no value in today's journalism, because the people who are paying the bills are only interested in how many clicks get onto a story. They don't generate a lot of money with their advertising, and if they can illustrate that there's a lot of people going to this particular story or this type of theme, then that gives them a little more leverage there. So, we have a very poor paying industry. It's hard to make a career in it. And, you just have to get the content out there in order to try and earn enough money to make a living at it. There's a lot of different things that have kind of come into play. The partisan issue is it's a lot broader in scope. I think you're going to have to maybe try to ask me some questions that kind of dissect it a little bit better. But overall, I came back into the industry hoping to kind of resurrect just the way we were trained in the past. I'm not sure I accomplished that, or if I'm still part of the problem. But it's not what we all agree. There's fake news out there, I would argue, and it's not necessarily the news we go to. It's always the other guy, and we see that in among the journalists pointing fingers as well.
Well, we've seen the landscape change tremendously, even in the past few years, not even in the past decades. Like the past few years now, everyone is going, YouTube relatively 10 years ago was a small website. Now it's probably one of the biggest consumption sites on planet Earth. This is where so many people go to consume content. They're also going to places like Facebook, Meta, Instagram, X, all of these different places. And the name of the game on these places is the most salacious thing gets the clicks, right? And famously, it was publications like BuzzFeed. What was the Gawker, I think, was one of them that doesn't even exist anymore. There was a few other ones. Vice is another example where they started off, they were supposed to be trying to be run and gun journalist types, and it quickly turned into this just a click generating thing? How can we, throw as many pinpoints on the trending topics and try to get as many clicks onto our articles as possible without any real care in the world for, is this ethical? Is this right? Are we telling the truth? Are we just misleading people? Are we giving people the wrong idea? What is the byproduct of all of this misleading? And of course, the term fake news keeps getting thrown around, but this I believe is a lot of the origins of this. What do you think of that?
I think you're onto something. One of the features that I noticed with the rise of the internet is entrepreneurs or other people were looking to maybe get out of, I don't know, their 9 to 5 that they were doing at a community newspaper or maybe a bigger outlet, and creating their own news website. And now we have so many choices to go to for current events that the market, like, I'm not sure they can build on, like, everybody's kind of tapped out. So my thought is these sites that you listed, like Vox and BuzzFeed, and you think of some of the ones like Mother Jones and Jezebel, and there's many out there, but they have a demographic that comes to them and they know what they're reading because they're clicking on them. They can tap into how much is being generated on a story. That's the red meat that they want to keep reading, and in order to keep that small demographic that they have coming back, they have to keep producing that material. I mean, the whole internet approach to journalism absolutely changed after Donald Trump became a politician. Everybody wanted to read about him, and that's where it seemed all these outlets kind of migrated to one type of coverage of him or the other. He's either the greatest president of all time or he's worse than Hitler, and there's no nuance that illustrates the successes, the flaws, the strengths, the weaknesses that we all have. And we see that with virtually everything. It keeps getting more and more political, and so I think you're onto something, that the way we have consumed news, or what we found interesting, we go to those sites, they know what we want, so they keep giving it to us. And so if it has to be sensational, or if it has to praise Trudeau or Trump or whatever, they're giving it to us because we're the consumers that are demanding it.
Well, it seems like as a journalist in media, like say you picked media, it's like pick a lane and go down that, and no deviation from that. There's no self-realization. There's no looking at the other side. It's turned all into punditry, where where do you even find a source that will tell you all the angles? What you have to do, and what I tend to have to do, is I'll have to go through multiple sources. If I read the Toronto Sun, I have to read the Toronto Star as like a compare and contrast about the same story. And I know one side's going to be ultra partisan in one direction and the other side is going to be ultra partisan in the other direction. And then maybe there's a few independent outlets that'll give you a little bit more nuance to the story, so you can draw your own conclusions. But there's no single one place that I found anyway that really just has a broad view of just what's happening in the world.
Yeah, I don't think it exists. There's no market for it now. Maybe we say we want that, but I'm not sure we do. Like, I would like to think, when I've talked to other people that are in journalism, especially those who are in it full time, they're pretty optimistic that the industry is going to correct itself and it's going to get back to, showing more balance in presenting stories on Trudeau or Poilievre or Trump or NAFTA or whatever. I don't think so. We're the consumers, like I say, that, if you're going to start showing more balance, like I think I sent you a couple of things. There was a New York Times there's an article that they wrote about, I guess there was a couple of mass shootings, and Donald Trump was president, and they had a headline that said, what I wrote it down here. Trump urges unity versus racism. Well, that upset all of the New York Times subscribers, that they demanded they change the headline, and they changed it to assailing hate but not guns. So that was their first edition. They, from the blowback from their readers, they demanded something that would make Donald Trump look worse. And so that they accommodated. There's examples of this all over the place now. And so that's why I think it's going to be more difficult if the New York Times, for example, was to start giving some positive press coverage to Donald Trump. Their reporters are going to quit or mutiny. Their subscribers are going to cancel. Like, they go there for the bad stuff on that guy, right? And I don't know, are we brainwashed to a degree that that's all we need to get our dopamine or something? I'm not sure. I will say, though, in Canada, which used to always have a very good reputation for media, there wasn't, we just culturally had a more neutral approach, and we needed it. I mean, the CBC was the only network that would get up to Northern Canada, so they kind of needed them to be professional, and they were. But, you know, nowadays, one of the big concerns that I would argue exists right now is a lot of the media outlets, and that goes for our smaller community newspapers as well. They have access to federal government money in order to stay afloat, or to hire reporters, or to do different things related to just producing news. There's a lot of I'll say independents, but there's a lot of outlets out there that don't rely on that money. If the tap was turned off today, I have a feeling that those outlets that are relying on that government money would have to look in the mirror and try to figure out, now what do we do? Because that's part of how they budget. The ones that don't get any of that money, they're going to continue to survive because they figured out how to do that in a market that gets no government money. So that's another issue that's kind of, I've seen come up, and talked to others who've seen that government money have influence in how the editorial decisions of their newspapers or media outlets are conducted. So that's a problem in our country too.
Well, it really shined its ugly head when COVID came around, and the government was really pushing. The Trudeau government was really pushing their own narrative, and the media became a mouthpiece for them. They complied completely. You gave an example of this. I've actually shared this one on social media many a times, and this is that famous Toronto Star the cover page, where they just have this nasty stuff that they're quoting on this. Now, later on, the editor came out and said, oh, it was a mistake that they published it in this way. But was it, or did they just come out and say that after because there was so much backlash? I mean, this is in any sense, it's completely unethical. It's what do you even say to that? This is the media just being the mouthpiece for the government at the time.
Mm-hmm. So I'm just a regular Canadian like you, so I also have my own opinions of this. If I were to be covering that, though, if I was dispatched to take a look at the backlash, the feedback, the mea culpa of the Toronto Star, I have to try to give them the opportunity to explain how that happened. The same thing would go with this whole CT where they doctored a Pierre Poilievre quote to make it look like he was calling an election for a dental care program, right? And
that was huge. That was huge what they did. Yeah. And maybe the odd, person, or just the average person who doesn't do video editing. I mean, I do video editing, so I know what it takes to make that clip the way it was. It wasn't an accident, as they came and apologized for. They said, oopsie doopsie, oopsie poopsie, we accidentally did this. No, it was purposeful. It was very purposeful, and it was to lead people to have a misunderstanding of why Pierre Poilievre was doing what he was doing. He was doing it because of the carbon tax. He was not doing it because of dental care, which he had. I mean, maybe there's an objection over how they rolled out dental care, but he's not objecting to people receiving dental care. That's for sure. But that's how they made it sound. It's completely unethical.
Yeah, like if I'm a reporter, I don't create an opinion on that. I just say CTV has been accused of doctoring video to make Pierre Poilievre misrepresent what he was calling a non-confidence vote, and then try to continue to provide the facts that surround that, get statements from the Conservatives or Poilievre, get statements from CTV, or we're talking about the Toronto Star one there just a moment ago. But I mean, as a Canadian, that I think it's intentional. I know if my first jobs were for a wire service and for my community newspaper, and back then in the newspaper, if I was covering a story, I would put a listing out for our photographer to go to a certain location to take photographs. If we made a communication error where your name was wasn't published properly, like we had a different name down there, we would get called into the office by the managing editor, want to know why there was the mess up, how we're going to fix it, and make sure it doesn't happen again, because it made us look Bush League. That's just making a mistake with somebody's name. If we did that again a couple of weeks later, somebody's getting fired. Like it's such a lazy error. But these errors aren't even considered anything anymore, because we have these egregious ones that come up all the time now. I don't know. I'd argue that people are getting promoted when they do stuff like this, but it's a shame. It's not the type of thing they've ever done.
Failing upwards, as we call it. Now, so you sent me the image of their statement of retracting what had happened, or clarifying. So this is the statement from CTV National News. September 26, 2024, CTV National News today issued a following statement regarding a report on its September 22, 2024 broadcast. A report on Sunday's CTV National News broadcast did not meet our expected and required high editorial standards. We sincerely and reservedly apologize for the matter. This report went to air, and the false pretension is created. As is standard practice, we conducted an investigation to determine whether a breach of our editorial policies practices had occurred in this case. The investigation found that 2 members of the CTV News team are responsible for altering a video clip, manipulating it for a popular story. Their actions violate our editorial standards and are unacceptable. Those individuals are no longer members of the CTV News team. Our duty to provide accurate, fair, and balanced coverage of the issues that matter to Canadians, and to do so fully independently, is of the utmost importance to us. We will continue our work to earn the trust of millions of Canadians who turn to CTV News each and every day. Now, this was after they made a public statement on their show. I can't remember the name of the anchor or the news host, but he basically said, oops, it was a mistake, like it was an editorial mistake. And then they came out and clarified it, and came out and said they fired some people over this, which I think is,
I don't think they fired them. I think they just reassigned them to a different branch of their their organization. They would have been fired 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, but now this is, I think, part of the practice. I was watching TV with, I don't watch TV almost ever, but but I remember the date. It was October 28th, 2018, and a day or two earlier, there was that horrible synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, and the TV was on. I was hanging out with my wife, and CTV News came on. So whatever we were watching, that followed afterward, and I just started kind of paying attention. But they've been doing this since October 28th of 2018 anyway, because 6 of their lead stories were all framed around how bad Donald Trump is as a person and how he contributed to the synagogue shooting, and how, Bolsonaro in Brazil was gaining populism as Trump of the tropics, and then highlighted how corrupt that guy is. That network has been practicing this type of, faux journalism for years now, and it's part of the problem. They used to have street credibility, like all of the media outlets in Canada had, like I said, had a pretty good reputation. A lot of them are still living off of that reputation, and they don't deserve it anymore. This apology by CTV is probably genuine because they saw they were losing access to the federal Conservatives, and that was going to be tough for them. So they did the right thing.
Yeah, that's huge. So I should mention to everyone in the audience that, the Pierre Poilievre came out and said that he instructed his all of his members of his party to not speak with CTV over this matter, and for good reason, for good reason, and I can't blame him over this. But yeah, that's
so.
A great
That's
point.
why I think the apology was, framed as sincere as it was, because they knew that they were in jeopardy of access. With that said, it's kind of standard. It's just somebody with the Poilievre campaign, or his office, or I don't know, somebody, I can't remember who it was that picked up on it, but they were paying attention. You're going to probably start seeing more politicians, bringing their own cameras to record their interviews. I know Carrie Lake and Donald Trump have been doing it in the U.S., and I think Poilievre has done this occasionally up here, but they need to have a protection system in, because we are in the media are trying to find ways to misrepresent what they say and do. And this is a very clear example of what's happened in Canada.
That's just smart to have your own insurance policy. It's like having a dash cam in your car to save you from other people that are, scams or carjackings or things like that. People taking full advantage. What an insane situation. Because like the news went from, just telling you what's happening to become this ultra partisan thing, to then becoming libelous or slanderous. And in Canada, just like in Canada, it's very difficult. I think it is in the United States, but it's even more difficult when you're a public figure to sue for libel or slander, in the case that the media comes out and says something wrong. It's almost a losing battle. You might as well not even try. And
right.
But this is what they kind of rely on the fact that they can come out and say things that are absolutely false. So case in point is the case with Rachel Gilmore of Global News, when she was still employed by Global News. Now, Rachel Gilmore, I put her in the thumbnail because it pertains to what we're talking about today. But she was this young, energetic, TikTok type journalist that they had working for Global News right around the time of the convoy and when all that was happening. And she quickly gained a name for herself because of just the vile things that she would post. But one thing in particular was she wrote an article about James Topp, who is a military veteran who was kicked out of the forces for his vaccine status. I believe that was the case, correct? He lost a lot. He lost his pension. He lost a bunch of things. And in protest for what was happening, he decided he was going to march across Canada, all the way from Vancouver Island all the way to Ottawa. And subsequently,
it was actually Vancouver, not Vancouver Island, but yeah.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, fair. Thank you for correcting me. And then he subsequently went to Nova Scotia, and then he walked back to Ottawa, so that he got the whole distance. Now, just to take a shot at Pierre Poilievre, she wrote this article, insinuating that he had bad ties with bad people, and therefore guilt by association, yada yada. This is what we always hear. But in the URL, she put James Top white supremacist, and that was enough. That was enough to trigger a lawsuit from James Top to Global News to say this was slander. This is, he is a private citizen. Yes, he was doing a public thing, but other than him marching, he's a private citizen, and he's gone back to being a private citizen ever since. What a champ, by the way. Big, big shout out to James Top and for everything he's done. But unbelievable that a journalist thinks that's okay in this day and age, and it's only when a lawsuit comes is there any sort of recourse for that. The publishing body of Global News was fine with it. They let that slide. It got published.
Yeah, I'm loosely familiar with that circumstance, but when you say, journalists are okay with that, you didn't quite frame it that way, but essentially journalists are more activists now, I would probably use as the talking point, than they are reporters. And so when you feel you have a cause that's political or social or for whatever reason, you end up putting your story choices and your information together, and the people you interview will all be aligned with what your outlet or your own personal belief on the issue is. I covered a drag queen storytime event in Coquitlam, which is a Vancouver suburb here in BC, and there was about 24 people there to protest, which there's always protesters for these types of things out here. Yeah. But there were about 200 supporters. They had garnered a whole bunch of people to come at the last moment, and so there's a whole bunch of people there. And I was interviewing people on both sides and just asking the standard questions. Why are you here? And what do you think? But then I would ask people on each side, do you understand why the people on the other side of the street are also here? And nobody had any clue. And it's an illustration to me that where they're getting their news on this very polarizing issue, they're only getting the talking points that frame one side of it. So there's a large degree that we're failing in the media, that we're not taking a controversial issue like this and presenting it with more balance. But again, when I'm saying that we're kind of migrating to the sources that we want to affirm what we already believe, I suspect our Facebook threads and signal groups and everybody else, kind of agrees on these subjects. And so we keep getting feeds that reaffirm it there as well. But if the media were to be honest and approach these issues like the convoy or drag queen story time or whatever you want to pick, then we would have a lot more the ability for us to still communicate and not see the person that thinks differently than us as the enemy. We'd be a lot better off. It's how it used to be 20, 30 years ago when I was doing it. I would definitely say it's not like that now. But of course, the media outlets will all pretend, just like the CTV apology said, it doesn't meet up to their high editorial standards. Garbage. They don't have it. There's very little editorial standards that these outlets seem to regard. The ones that are independent and trying to survive on their own, they have a lot more risk if they go outside the goalposts and maybe do something that's going to be controversial or could create a lawsuit that they can't afford. So they have to balance what is a legitimate news story here. Is it worth the risk? And even as a Canadian public, there was a premier here in BC named Gordon Campbell Now, he had an election where he said, we're not raising our salaries. And then, boom, he raised salaries for the MLAs immediately after he was elected. He was caught drinking and driving in Hawaii, which was sort of considered a scandal, but not as big as a political lie. The next election, he said, we're not going to go with the harmonized sales tax. BC doesn't want it, got elected. Harmonized sales tax, he's bringing it in. And that dogged him because the media didn't let that issue go. So he really had like 2-3 sort of things that made him look bad. That cost him his job. And now we're looking at like Justin Trudeau. His administration has had, at least that I'm aware of, and I don't follow Canadian news too much, but at least 5 ethics violations. We're seeing them shut down committees because they don't want evidence to be brought in, and Parliament is shut down because he's not giving over the documents that show likely that his MPs were getting like funneling money into their own businesses. And we still have support for him and his party in this country. I'm just using Campbell and Trudeau as a contrast to how I think the media has failed. Back then, they took, your political efforts seriously, or at least more seriously. We expect them always to lie, but we're still reporting on it. And if you're not answering, you're dodging it. It's still in the news cycle. Whereas now, like, I'll bet you most of us can't even name like one or no more than that of the ethics violations that his party has had. So we don't care. Like, what's going on? Again, I bring it all back to the media not doing their job, but I have a pretty bony finger to point at them for everything.
Oh, well, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the most recent one is the accusations that Pierre Poilievre needs to go and get his security clearance. They keep telling him, get your NSICOP security clearance. What are you doing? You're being irresponsible. But they're not reporting the other side of the story, which I've been shouting from the treetops saying, NSICOP was designed so that if anybody joins in and gets that security clearance, anything that they learn, they have to stay silent about for the rest of their lives, under the threat of possibly 14 years in jail. It's in the legislation. It's insane. But the media just will not tell that part of the story. They'll say all the stuff about how he's not getting the clearance and how it's unethical or it's dangerous or all these things. But if people understood the whole story, it's this lying by omission. You're not telling the story. And so I put a short together and I said to my audience, anytime these politicians or the media is saying the same lie by omission, post this clip in as a reply. Just post it, just rip it, put it out there, just so people can understand. People that are in the replies might see why, because like what else would be the reason other than being irresponsible to not want to know who's been involved in foreign interference in our country, in our elections. It's absurd though. We're at a level of absurdity with this media. What was like when you went to school? Obviously, they told you don't lie. They tell you don't tell both sides of the story. But what would they say about the propensity for people to want to just omit certain topics, omit certain facts that would possibly change the entire narrative of the story if you just leave that one thing out?
Mm-hmm. I don't remember ever being told that, because you were always to try and figure out how many different viewpoints could this story have, and you're supposed to pursue those. So even though we would be, more liberal minded as just our class, it just never came up for us to even consider how do we protect this particular figure or business or government, because it's what I think has to happen. My goodness, Clyde, like we would, by the way, lots of drinkers in the industry, so that might have something to do with it too. But, we were talking like, how far would you go to get a scoop or break a story? There's all these visions that people had of, kind of crossing a boundary, like, would you smoke illegal drugs or would you sleep with this person for a story? And this was just kind of newsroom chatter, right? Because we're all dreaming big, I guess. But we did have an ethics class that was kind of going over a lot of the different things related to legal issues, and when do you put your camera down and stop being a journalist and start being a citizen. So we had to approach those things, and in my case, I thought we were trained really well. And so when we went out into the field, like, this just didn't come up. I'm sure it did from time to time, maybe, but we were just trained that we're there to report, hold government accountable. We're also taught how to do what you never see anymore, but feature articles. So, like, kind of the good news stories about, I don't know, a 10-year-old girl who started a recycling program in her school that now the whole city embraces, like,
yeah.
There's a lot of different areas for us to kind of pursue. So I wouldn't say that they even brought up that, you're not going to want to lie about this one, because it just wasn't part of our curriculum. We weren't expected to lie ever.
Okay, so yeah, they just assumed that you guys had morals going into it. Fair enough. And
Right.
you're into it for the right things.
Mm-hmm. Again, we're back to, the integrity of the industry is crumbling, or has crumbled. I drive a truck full time, and I would go around the satellite radio listening to all these different stations that had their own view on a particular issue, and these stations for Canada, these stations for international. And you'd kind of be able to glean a little bit, but they were never off base too much. But I mean, this to go one step further by omission, and we see that all the time nowadays when we have unnamed sources and we have doctored quotes, or quotes that only have 2 or 3 words, and then they can frame the context around that.
Or my personal favorite, when somebody says, "Oh, so experts are saying," or "some people say," and this is just a euphemism for "insert my own opinion now." This is this is them editorializing.
Well, do you remember
they're not actually fighting anybody.
That the Soyuz newspaper, when the editor was interviewing Pierre Poilievre, and he was eating the apple, and he was saying things like, people are saying that you're taking pages out of Donald Trump's playbook, and he's like, what people? And he's like, you're here doing you're doing a populist movement. What does that mean? And I mean, everybody saw that, but that's exactly what we tend to do when we want to have a gotcha moment or an adversarial interview. It doesn't serve any purpose other than to try and either get you some hits on your Instagram page, I guess, or however you're trying to brand yourself as a reporter. Or you're, like I said, maybe if you can do it to the right person, maybe you'll get a promotion, with the media outlet that you're a part of. We never used to do that. Maybe we did, I guess, a little bit, but it is definitely part of how it's conducted now. We see it, we condemn it. I don't know how to fix it, though. We have an industry that doesn't punish people for doing the wrong thing. Like I said about those 2 CTV video room editors, they've been reassigned. They're still part of CTV. They're just not part of the hard news anymore. Maybe they're doing sports, or they're doing, some other duty that keeps them away from, the cutting room floor. But
I think the only thing that anyone's ever been really fired for has been going against the COVID narrative. That's why we hear lots of stories of people getting fired for for that. I want to ask you about a concept of Wag the Dog. You brought up the drag time story hour, those scenarios that happen quite often. They're still happening today, a little less frequency because there's other events that are happening. But when it comes to those, I've always kind of looked at it like, what, you know, the media kind of whips these things up into a frenzy, and then they wait. It's kind of like baiting a trap. You know, you say this event is going to happen at this time, and you say it to all the right people, and then the people that get angry about it, they're going to show up, and the people at the counter are going to show up, and then they get their feeding frenzy. It's like dolphins batting herring into a ball. You get these activists on both sides. They bat them into this ball, and then they get in there with their cameras, and they get the photographs that they want. They get this division that they're looking for. I know there's a lot of people that tune into my channel that are very much against the drag time story hour thing, and I've encouraged people as an activist myself, the activist side of me. I say, if you're against that, don't go to the event. Go to the police station and get a group of you and say, we all want to file a complaint for a crime that's being committed right now. You know, do it that way, so that the reporters don't get what they're looking for. They're looking for this confrontation so that they can sell articles. This is really what it's all about. It's clicks, generating views, generating ad revenue, instances on whatever website. And what do you think of this concept of the media and them being able to manipulate the real world, wag the dog, as you would?
I certainly think the media's influence has a profound effect on what's happening culturally in the Western world, for sure. I'm not sure that they're trying to create too many stories, but when they know there is an opportunity for a photo op, I would imagine they would want to be there. That's not as easy nowadays because we don't typically have, as many newsrooms. There's a national scope for a lot of media that, you can write about St. John's, Newfoundland, something going on there from your house in Squamish, and you'd have to rely on somebody else to go out and take that photograph. But certainly the way they choose stories has an influence on how we perceive. There's a great one. One of the satellite stations I would listen to was National Post Radio, and I don't listen to it anymore. But they'd have a regular host from Monday to Thursday, then they'd have a Friday host, and then in this particular circumstance, the main host was on vacation, so the Friday host was covering 2 weeks of his absence. So on one of those mornings, they opened up with, there's a big news day because Canadians just died several hours earlier in a terrorist attack in Spain. Oh, and wow. Historically, that is the lead all across the country. There's nothing that can top that, or very little that could. I suppose a nuclear bomb maybe somewhere, but that's big news. Canadians dead, terrorist attack. This is what we know so far. We want to know as Canadians. But what this host did and her producer is they were talking about, we finally have proof that Donald Trump is a racist. And that was the very fine people comment. Now, the day before, I actually listened to that press conference on satellite. And I was like, what are they talking about? I didn't hear anything. And they're popping champagne and high-fiving, not talking at all about these dead Canadians. And this is one of the, areas that you're sort of touching on about, omitting information here or creating something that might be misleading because they're not covering all angles of a story. Here's a great example where for them, the most pertinent story for their Canadian audience is a manufactured story about Donald Trump and racism, not that Canadians were just murdered abroad in a terrorist attack, and is there going to be more? Like, there's so many different threads you can kind of go down there. I sort of forget what you said. I think it was about wagging the dog, but
yes,
when your front page says, I hope the unvaccinated all die, like, you're putting a message to your readers and your listeners and your followers, your subscribers. And the more you do that, my sense is the more we start demanding to hear that. And if you're not going to keep, raising that bar, or at least meeting it with that type of sensational type of content, then we're going to go find it somewhere else. And there's lots of choices for it.
it's very true.
This is why I think it's tough, Clyde, for the media to regain trust in the consumers. Like, it's a different world, and it's a different industry out there. Like, I will pitch a story, and my editor has to balance a lot of different factors. One, I'm going to have usually a lot of interviews and more research. I'm not in it for the money. I want to get paid, but I'm not doing it for that. I have another job that pays my bills. But his copy editing staff, which is very thin, is going to be spending, 3 times as much time on my story than 3 other stories that would be submitted. So he's got to balance that. Is there a risk that, they have to decide how it's going to be viewed on a social media platform? Could they be getting a strike from that? Could they face a legal issue? We sort of touched on that as well. And so with all of that, it's the broad boundaries that we used to, here's kind of the story, but here's the big picture. And we used to have that freedom to sort of pursue it and make a big, balanced, informative story. But now they're much more comfortable keeping those narrow boundaries and stay within those goalposts and don't stray out. It just makes life easier for all of us. And this is with like Epic Times, which I find one of the reason I guess I probably chose them to apply was I found that their journalistic standards were as good as any that I had seen. But they also have their limits, and they have a big footprint in the US, smaller here, but he's got to kind of keep that in mind. And even with Epic Times, we covered the truckers convoy. We covered James Topp. I broke that story. We led on like vaccine truth. And a lot of people came to this media outlet because they knew there was information out there, but nobody else was covering it. And so again, they know that this was something that people like maybe your viewers were interested in, and they were responding to it. So they would put more content like that out there, but they don't want to get too caught up in just having a newspaper that's all about the truckers or COVID or whatever. It's a tough balance. And, but I don't know how we go back to where we just, have a variety of sort of just what would constitute news stories. Like it's such a difficult landscape to pursue now. Nobody trusts the media, so maybe it's better just to kind of keep your demographic that you've attained and make sure that they stay happy and they keep coming back. I think though, and I'll repeat this, if the money was turned off from the federal government, there would be a reckoning in a lot of these, boardrooms with the editorial staff on, can we survive without it? Like, or do we have to start changing our outlook and how we go about things? A friend of mine was telling me he was talking to somebody who's very high up with Glacier Media, who, confided like that they're on a razor's edge right now, and may not be here tomorrow, kind of a thing. So, and then I think they're getting government money as well. There's a lot of options for that. I shouldn't say because I don't know for sure.
Yeah, well, okay, so I wanted to continue on with what you're saying.
We pick our stories largely based on what our audience wants.
Yeah, so I want to keep going on that thread, but before we go too far away from it, I do want to share that Snopes finally did debunk the the very fine people hoax. It took them years. It took them, I think, almost 8 years to do it, but they finally did. They came out and they said that no, it's false. That it was completely taken out of context. He said there were fine people on both sides of the protest, but he's not talking about. He specifically says, "I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and those white supremacists. Those people should be condemned completely." That's what he said, and they cut that part out, and then they had their way with it. But yeah, getting back to what you were sharing there, with the news media and the idea that the government pays them to stay alive. Now, this is an interesting thread that we're kind of getting down, because the government tried to basically take over news media in Canada. They did with Bill C-18. They tried to regulate it in a way that would force the new media, which is social media companies, to pay these media agencies or these news organizations that are labeled as news organizations by some government entity, pay them for their links being shared on social media. And in their infinite wisdom, they didn't even check with the people who are in the industry to find out what would happen. And what ended up happening was Meta banned news in Canada. They just banned Canadian news from their website platform entirely, and so it shut them off. So the only people that you'll get news from on Meta are either independents or people who are doing it in opinion pieces like myself, or you'll get it from American news outlets. And one of the things that I thought might actually occur is that a lot of journalists might actually leave Canada, work for American news outlets, and report on Canadian news from an American news outlet in order to give news on Meta to Canadian viewers. I know that's completely counterintuitive to what they were hoping for, but this is the beauty. This is why I studied economics, because I love the idea that people might have this plan, but there's this law of unintended consequences. It's not about who you're trying to affect initially. It's about who else is it going to affect down the road, and what are all these unintended consequences that are going to occur. The government didn't see that coming, but in their infinite wisdom of trying to manipulate the media, they manipulated it actually against themselves, or against Trudeau anyway, in this case.
Yeah, you might be right. I disagree with you, though. Like, I have a different opinion, and I think that was the consequence they intended. I think they wanted to stop the spread of negative news that was steamrolling with Justin Trudeau. Facebook and a lot of these social media platforms, that's where a lot of us forward those types of articles to the other people that we're connected to. So my thought was that that's what they wanted. They wanted to slow that spread of news down, and they probably succeeded. But that's just an opinion. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't think they were looking out for the media whatsoever. I know I met a guy who he worked for, I forget the name of the outlet, but anyways, it's a community newspaper up in the Kootenays here in BC. And he was there for 10 or 15 years. Then he went and started doing something else, but still freelanced for them. And they got like a salary to pay for a reporter for a year, and they reapplied for it and got it again. And but he was still submit his content, and there's never been a problem in 20 years that he had been writing for them. But then he had something to do with I don't know, it was related to COVID mandates or vaccine statistics or something like that, and they cut it. And when he was asking, well, at least the way he related to me, when he was asking, what's going on, the dots he connected is that they couldn't risk ticking off the government that was giving them money. But please still keep giving us stuff. Like, we love you and your work, but just not stuff that's related to the government. So that would seem to be a great example of how a small editorial staff were making decisions based on that. So, because I think that was intentional, they wanted media to be friendly to the Trudeau government. The consequences of cutting off Facebook and Instagram and whatever X, moving news stories through the country, I would think they probably knew that was going to happen too, and that's what they wanted. That's my thought.
Interesting. Yeah. Because I was following the articles. Pablo Rodriguez at the time, he was the one, minister of communications or heritage minister.
Yeah.
And
culture.
He was counting his chickens before they hatched. He was saying, like, we're gonna raise $300 million for the news media through this. So they were already counting how much cash they were gonna get, and they got nothing. But I love hearing other people's opinions on these things, because this is where you could differ on this. This is great. I want to, before we run out of time here, I want to, because we've addressed a lot of the issues with media now. What do you think is a step in the right direction? What do you think that we could plausibly do in the scenario that we're at to get back to something more resembling ethical journalism moving forward?
Right. I've thought about this a lot. I've talked about it a lot, and I don't have any impactful answers, I don't think. There are some of my colleagues who feel a little more strongly about it, but the bigger things is, and if you were to contact the editorial board of whatever news outlet and complain because of bias or something factual or something that you're just not thinking they're showing their professionalism in, that does make a difference, especially when a lot of people do that. I do have an example from my own personal history, but this goes back like 20 years. And I got a retraction from the Vancouver Sun because of it. That said, we're not really going to the media that we already have labeled as fake news or we have a problem with. So we're not going to be getting that opportunity because we've kind of just written them off. So we don't even check to see if they're any good anymore, or they're getting back to being professional. But that is one thing that tends to make a difference, is if a number of people do contact the editorial board and said, hey, you didn't cover this fairly or factually, I do have a problem with that. The only tangible thing that might have a longer term effect is if we do support the independents that rely on subscriptions or donations to help keep those, their platforms or their media outlets alive. There's a lot of effort to try and to show a little more integrity when you're relying on subscriptions and advertising revenue compared to, government handouts or, sort of big corporate dollars that come through, a broader advertising platform from, whatever, Canadian Tire or something like that. Mm-hmm. Somebody like you, if you started losing subscribers, you're probably going to do a quick evaluation of what it was that you did and see if you have to apologize or do you have to, make some type of adaptation or correction. You take like Blacklock's Reporter and Western Standard and Epic Times and Countersignal, and they're all relying on subscribers to kind of keep them afloat. And then you have independent people, Will Dove, and there's a whole bunch that are out there to try and do what they think is got a little more professionalism to it. So supporting them is a good way to also, if the tap is turned off of all the other ones, these guys are still going to survive, and then maybe their profile will be raised a little bit more. The other thing is the community newspaper is starting to fade. It's becoming a lot more difficult for a lot of these communities to still have those, and those have always been very critical to help keep a community together. I would just sort of keep that in the back of your mind too, that even if you don't read the flyers that come with it, or you usually recycle it, maybe put a little more time in finding a way to give them some type of support by at least reading it or going on their website to show that there is some interest out there. Once those go, because they don't need to be they don't really have to be political too much with, because they're just doing, here's our, ugly potato day, and here's, what the midget hockey team did. They're covering community events that don't have that political context. And if they die out, they're going to have a bigger impact in the community. So I would say we should probably try to put more effort into those, at least by going online, showing that we're checking out some of their stories, and hopefully we can help them survive. They'll be the backbone for any kind of change, I think, that because they need to survive in order for that to happen.
Jeff Sanders, where can people find you online, or where they can read you in print media?
I'm just actually a freelance contributor. Most of my stuff I give to Epic Times, but I usually have blocks of months where I can't contribute anything. So entering the winter season, so I'm about ready to kind of take up the mantle. The summer is always really busy for me. So, but yeah, maybe what we'll do is we'll hook up again and cover more of this. And yeah, I don't carry a social media profile or anything. I'm kind of off the grid, and I've done that by design. So
that's impressive. That really is. I appreciate you coming. Thank you so much.